How one worker exposed China's hidden detention camps. Chapter 1. The man nobody expected. Picture a quiet university office in Germany. The year is 2017. Outside, the world goes about its business. People commute, children go to school, politicians give speeches about trade deals and diplomatic progress. Inside that office sits a man that almost nobody has ever heard of. His name is Adrian Zenz. He is not a spy. He is not a soldier. He is not a seasoned investigative journalist with a team of researchers and a massive budget behind him. He is a German-born academic, a theologian turned social anthropologist, who spends most of his days reading dry government budget documents, procurement contracts, and public administrative filings published by the People's Republic of China. It is, by most people's standards, unglamorous work. Zenz funds part of his research by moonlighting as a programmer for a small streaming startup. He is, in every sense of the phrase, an ordinary man. And yet, within just a few years, this mild-mannered academic would do something that governments with intelligence agencies, armies of analysts, and billions of dollars in surveillance budgets had either failed or refused to do. He would single-handedly force the most powerful authoritarian government on Earth to change its official story. He would force Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, a government that controls the lives of 1.4 billion people, that commands nuclear weapons, that operates the world's most advanced mass surveillance state, to abandon its lies and shift to a new, equally false narrative. All from his desk, alone, reading documents that were hiding in plain sight on the internet. The story of how Adrian Zenz exposed China's secret network of detention camps is one of the most extraordinary tales of individual courage and intellectual audacity of the 21st century. It is a story about the power of a single determined person against an empire of silence. It is a story about a network of secret facilities so vast, so methodically constructed, and so carefully hidden from the world's view that even those who suspected they existed could not prove it until one man did. And even after he proved it, the Chinese government tried everything in its enormous power to destroy him, discredit him, and silence him. They failed. But before we get to the files, the hacked computers, the 5,000 photographs of prisoners staring blankly at police cameras, the internal speeches calling for shoot-to-kill orders, before all of that, we need to understand what was happening in the far northwest of China, in a remote region most Westerners had never heard of, among a people most of the world had forgotten. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time and you want more stories like this, real stories, documented facts, extraordinary people who changed history from the most unlikely positions, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell. Every week we bring you deep dives into the moments and the people that the history books don't always reach. Now let's go back to Xinjiang. Chapter 2. Xinjiang. A land under siege. Xinjiang. The name means new frontier in Mandarin Chinese. It is the largest administrative region in China. A vast, dramatic landscape of deserts, mountains, and ancient Silk Road cities in the far northwest of the country, bordering 8 nations, including Russia, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. For centuries, this region has been home to the Uyghurs, a predominantly Muslim, Turkic-speaking ethnic group with their own language, their own rich culture, their own traditions of music, poetry, food, and faith. Uyghurs have lived in this land for over 1,000 years. They are not Chinese by language, culture, or religion. They are a distinct people with a distinct identity, and that distinctness, from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, was a problem. Since the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, Beijing has sought to integrate Xinjiang ever more tightly into the Han-dominated Chinese nation. Tensions between the Uyghur population and Han Chinese settlers, encouraged to migrate to Xinjiang by government incentives, have simmered for decades. In July 2009, those tensions exploded into bloody riots in the regional capital Urumqi, leaving nearly 200 people dead and thousands injured. For Beijing, the riots were a turning point. They were interpreted not merely as civil unrest, but as the manifestation of a dangerous separatist and extremist threat, one that the party resolved to crush completely and permanently. The man Beijing chose to execute that campaign was Chen Quanguo, a hardened Communist Party apparatchik with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Chen had previously served as party secretary of Tibet, where he had overseen the construction of an all-encompassing surveillance and control apparatus to suppress Tibetan resistance. In August 2016, he was transferred to Xinjiang, and he arrived with a clear mandate from President Xi Jinping: bring the region to heel. What followed was a transformation unlike anything seen in the modern world outside of wartime. Beginning in 2017, Xinjiang became the testing ground for the most ambitious system of high-tech mass surveillance and social control ever constructed. Facial recognition cameras were installed on every street corner, in every mosque, at every checkpoint. A smartphone application called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, known as the IJOP, was deployed, requiring citizens to register their daily movements, relationships, and activities with authorities. Uyghurs found their phones seized at checkpoints and scanned for banned content. Anything related to Islam, anything showing contact with people abroad, any news from outside China's censored internet. Mosques were demolished or stripped of their domes and minarets. Qurans were confiscated. Fasting during Ramadan was prohibited. Children were forbidden from receiving religious education. The Arabic script of the Uyghur language was suppressed. A civilization was being systematically dismantled piece by piece in real time. And then the camps appeared. Or rather, the camps appeared, were hidden, and the lies began. Chapter 3. The Disappearing People. It started, as so many atrocities do, with whispers. In 2017 and into 2018, Uyghurs living abroad, in Turkey, Germany, the United States, Australia, and elsewhere, began losing contact with their families back in Xinjiang. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages were met with silence. And when relatives abroad managed to get someone on the line, the conversations were brief, strange, and terrifying. Family members speaking in clipped, careful sentences as if being listened to. And then, nothing. Entire family networks going silent at once. At first, no one could say for certain what was happening. The Chinese government offered no explanation. When international journalists attempted to report from Xinjiang, they were followed, harassed, and turned away from certain areas entirely. Satellite images showed the construction of large, fortified complexes in remote areas, but Beijing said nothing about them. Uyghur exile organizations collected testimonies from people who had managed to leave the region, and those testimonies were chilling. Stories of being rounded up, taken to facilities surrounded by walls and watchtowers, and subjected to political indoctrination sessions that lasted for hours every day. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination took notice. In August 2018, Gay McDougall, a member of that committee, stated publicly that reliable reports indicated that around 1 million Uyghurs were being held in what she described as internment camps. China's representative at the session dismissed the allegations as, quote, outright lies. The camps, Beijing insisted, did not exist. Xinjiang, the government claimed, was a model of peaceful development and intercultural harmony. The Muslim minorities of the region were flourishing. Anyone who said otherwise was an enemy of China, spreading disinformation. That was the official story. And for a time, an astonishing, infuriating time, much of the world seemed willing to at least consider giving Beijing the benefit of the doubt. China was, after all, a rising superpower. It was the world's largest trading nation. It hosted global supply chains that clothed, equipped, and connected billions of people. Governments had economic incentives to look away. International institutions moved cautiously. The question of what was really happening in Xinjiang remained, frustratingly, an open one, a matter of testimony and satellite images and accusations that China could wave away as Western interference. But in a quiet office in Germany, a man with no government clearance, no secret sources, and no intelligence apparatus was reading Chinese government documents on the internet. And he was beginning to find something extraordinary. Chapter 4. The detective who taught himself Adrian Zenz was born in 1974 in Germany. His intellectual journey is an unusual one. He trained first as a theologian, then pivoted to social anthropology, completing a PhD at the prestigious University of Cambridge on the subject of minority education and ethnic identity among young Tibetans in Western China. The subject matter brought him into contact with the Chinese government's approach to ethnic minorities, and what he found troubled him deeply. Zenz is fluent in Mandarin Chinese, a skill that would prove to be the master key to everything that followed. He spent time doing ethnographic fieldwork in Western China and became deeply familiar with the particular dry bureaucratic language in which Chinese government administrative documents are written. He learned how to read procurement documents, budget reports, and local government planning filings. Documents so dense and specialized that even most native Chinese speakers would find them nearly incomprehensible. For Zenz, they became a form of map. In early 2018, Zenz was working at the European School of Culture and Theology in Korntal, Germany, a small institution with no particular connection to intelligence work or international affairs, when he began seeing reports from Uyghur exile media organizations about something unusual happening in Xinjiang. He decided to investigate, the only way he knew how, by reading the documents. What Zenz discovered was hiding in plain sight on Chinese government websites, in the kind of administrative filings that nobody in the outside world ever reads. He began finding procurement orders, requests for bids from construction companies to build large facilities in various locations across Xinjiang. The documents were written in the bland, technical language of government contracting, specifications for perimeter walls of certain heights, for surveillance camera systems, for dormitory facilities, for political education classrooms. Individually, each document was innocuous. Taken together, they told a story. Zenz matched these procurement documents with budget allocations, government spending plans that showed massive increases in expenditure on security-related facilities in Xinjiang. In 2017 alone, construction spending on such facilities increased by 20 billion yuan, approximately $2.96 billion US dollars at the time. He cross-referenced this with reports from local governments about hiring thousands of new security personnel and with job postings that specified positions with titles like ideological instructor and re-education center management. He connected the dots across hundreds of documents, building a detailed picture of a system being constructed at enormous speed and scale. In May 2018, Zenz published his findings in a report for the Washington-based Jamestown Foundation. His conclusion was staggering. Based on the documentary evidence he had gathered, he estimated that between 100,000 and over 1 million Muslims were being held in what amounted to a network of extrajudicial detention camps across Xinjiang. The camps, he argued, were not voluntary vocational training centers as Beijing would later claim. They were forced detention facilities, constructed in secret, operating outside the Chinese legal system, designed to confine and politically re-educate entire ethnic and religious communities. The report landed like a bomb. But then something even more extraordinary happened. Beijing blinked. Chapter 5. The moment Beijing changed its story. For months following Zenz's initial publication, the Chinese government maintained its position. There were no mass detention camps in Xinjiang. The allegations were fabrications, Western interference, anti-China propaganda. But Zenz did not stop. He kept reading. He kept publishing. and other researchers and journalists, following the trail he had blazed, began to find corroborating evidence. Satellite imagery, cross-referenced with the construction documents Zenz had identified, showed the facilities growing rapidly in size. Reuters published analysis showing that 39 camp facilities had nearly tripled in total area between April 2017 and August 2018, covering a combined space roughly the size of 140 soccer fields. By late 2018, the weight of the evidence had become too great to deny. In October of that year, the Chinese government quietly introduced a change to its official position. Xinjiang's regional legislature passed a law legalizing what it called vocational skills education and training centers, the first official acknowledgement that such facilities existed. Beijing had shifted its story. The camps did exist, but they were not prisons. They were voluntary educational institutions where willing participants came to learn Mandarin Chinese and vocational skills and to be gently guided away from extremist ideas. Attendance was presented as free, beneficial, and entirely voluntary. This was, by any measure, a remarkable capitulation. The Chinese Communist Party, a government that never admits mistakes, that rarely retreats from a stated position under international pressure, that views any concession as a sign of weakness to be exploited by enemies, had changed its official narrative. It had not been forced to do so by a rival superpower, by military threat, or by a major international institution. It had been forced by a German academic in his office, who had read its own documents more carefully than it expected anyone to. But Zenz was far from finished, and the story was about to become much darker and much larger. Chapter 6. The Papers That Shook the World. On November 16, 2019, the New York Times published an article under the headline, "Absolutely No Mercy, Leaked Files Expose How China Organized Mass Detention of Muslims." The article was based on a cache of over 400 pages of internal Chinese government documents that had been leaked to the Times by a member of China's own political establishment, someone inside the system who was so horrified by what was happening that they risked everything to get the truth out. The documents were authenticated by Zenz and other experts. They were classified, marked confidential and internal, and they had never been intended for outside eyes. What was in them was devastating. The Xinjiang Papers, as they came to be known, contained internal speeches by senior Communist Party officials laying out the logic and the mechanics of the detention campaign with chilling clarity. A speech by Xi Jinping himself, delivered in 2014 following a series of terrorist attacks, had called for China to show absolutely no mercy in dealing with extremism in Xinjiang. Other documents showed senior officials explicitly discussing the goal of transforming Uyghur cultural and religious identity, not merely combating terrorism, but systematically dismantling an ethnic community's sense of who it was. The Xinjiang Papers described a system of surveillance and detention that operated entirely outside the Chinese legal system. People could be detained not for committing crimes, but for behaviors that officials classified as indicators of potential extremism. Praying regularly, wearing a veil, having relatives abroad, owning a VPN, possessing a Quran, or having too many children. The documents described point-scoring systems used to assess the danger level of individuals. They outlined procedures for preventing detainees from telling their families where they had been taken. They described measures to stop detainees from learning the legal system well enough to challenge their detention. The publication of the Xinjiang Papers triggered an international storm. U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell described the documents as a handbook for an Orwellian campaign to effectively erase a religious and ethnic minority. Joe Biden, then a presidential candidate, called China's treatment of Uyghurs among the worst abuses of human rights in the world today. Multiple U.S. lawmakers cited the documents in calling for the passage of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which was eventually signed into law by President Donald Trump in June 2020. But even the Xinjiang Papers, extraordinary as they were, could not fully answer the question of what was actually happening inside the camps. They showed the system from the top down, through the eyes of the officials who designed it. What was needed was evidence from inside, the faces, the names, the individual human beings who had been swallowed by this machine. That evidence, and the story of how it came to be released, belongs to a chapter of this story, as dramatic as any spy thriller ever written. Chapter 7. The Caracas List and the Anatomy of Detention. In February 2020, Zenz published another bombshell. He had come into possession of a leaked document unlike anything previously seen. A 137-page spreadsheet containing detailed records of 301 detainees held in camps in Caracas County in southern Xinjiang's Hotan Prefecture. The document, which Zenz named the Caracas List, was unlike anything that had previously been made public. It was not a high-level policy document. It was not a speech or a planning report. It was a casebook, a bureaucrat's record of individual human beings and the reasons they had been detained. What those reasons revealed was chilling beyond description. The Caracas List showed that the vast majority of people being held in the camps had not been detained for anything that anyone in the outside world would recognize as a crime. They had been detained for praying, for fasting, for owning a prayer mat, for attending a mosque, for having relatives living outside China, for having a passport, for sending a text message that contained a religious phrase. One man was detained because his wife wore a face veil, another because he had too many children, yet another because he had, at some point in the past, received a phone call from a sibling living in another country. The document also showed the network of informants and surveillance mechanisms that fed the detention system. Information about detainees had been gathered through a combination of the IGOP surveillance app, visits by government officials assigned to live in Uyghur homes and report on the family's activities, and ordinary citizens reporting on their neighbors. The system was totalizing. There was no sphere of private life that was not potentially monitored and potentially punishable. Zenz told CNN that the Caracas List was really significant to all of us because it shows us the paranoid mindset of a regime that's controlling the up-and-coming superpower of this globe. The document was authenticated and its findings were impossible to dismiss. Here, in the dry columns of a bureaucratic spreadsheet, was the human cost of what Beijing was doing. Real people, real names, real reasons. Reasons that in most countries of the world would be considered ordinary expressions of religious and cultural identity. And still, Zenz kept digging. And still, the most explosive revelation had not yet come. Chapter 8. The Anonymous Hacker and the Digital Break-In. By 2022, the international conversation about Xinjiang had changed fundamentally. The United States government had officially declared China's actions in Xinjiang to constitute genocide. The European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other Western nations had imposed sanctions on Chinese officials, including the architect of the crackdown, Chen Quanguo. The U.S. Congress had passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, effectively banning the import of any goods from Xinjiang absent proof that they had not been produced with forced labor. Xinjiang cotton, which accounted for a significant share of the world's supply, had become a moral and commercial flashpoint. But for all the international attention, for all the testimonies and satellite images and leaked documents, one thing remained elusive: visual proof from inside the camps themselves. The Chinese government had carefully controlled any access to the facilities, orchestrating occasional press tours that showed gleaming classrooms and smiling students engaged in cheerful vocational activities. Independent journalists and human rights investigators had been denied access. The camps remained, in the visual sense, invisible. Then, sometime in early 2022, Adrian Zenz received a message through social media. The message came from someone he had never met, someone who gave no name, and someone who said they had something extraordinary to share. This anonymous individual claimed to have done something almost unthinkable. They had hacked into the internal police computer networks of the public security bureaus of two predominantly Uyghur counties in Xinjiang, Konashehir County in the Kashgar Prefecture and Tekes County in the Ili Kazakh Prefecture, and they had extracted everything they could find. The material they had retrieved amounted to more than 10 gigabytes of data. It included thousands of photographs, mugshots taken of detainees inside the camps, images of police conducting drills, pictures of the internal spaces of the facilities. It included classified government speeches by senior officials. It included operational protocols for running the camps, instructions on how to manage detainees, what force could be used and under what circumstances, how transfers between facilities should be conducted. It included spreadsheets detailing the identities and detention records of more than 20,000 Uyghurs. It included training materials for police and guards. It was, in short, the most comprehensive insider view of China's detention system that had ever been obtained. The anonymous source, who wishes to remain anonymous due to personal safety concerns, in the words of the subsequent publication, reached out to Zenz because by 2022, Zenz had become the world's foremost expert on Xinjiang's detention system, the person most likely to know what to do with the files, and most likely to be trusted by the international community to handle them responsibly. Zenz spent weeks examining the material, authenticating it, assessing its contents. He was, in his own words, stunned. It was sheer unbelievable. Zenz later told PBS NewsHour, "I looked at it bit by bit. I communicated with the source. It was quite a sort of credible interaction. And at the end of the day, of course, the files speak for themselves. An expert like myself, I don't like to necessarily trust material based on a source. I like to trust the material by looking at it, authenticating it, comparing it to existing leaks, looking at internal consistency." The files were authentic, and they were devastating. Chapter 9. The faces of the imprisoned Zenz shared the files with a consortium of 14 major international media organizations, including the BBC, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and others. The consortium spent months, from early 2022, independently authenticating the material before publishing. On May 24, 2022, the files were released publicly under the name the Xinjiang Police Files. The impact was immediate and shattering. For the first time, the world was looking at photographs taken inside China's Xinjiang camps, not staged government press tour images, but unauthorized, unfiltered documentation of the reality within. More than 5,000 mugshots of Uyghur detainees stared out from the files. Men, women, the elderly, the young. They were photographed in the clinical, dehumanizing manner of any police booking system, facing forward, then to the side. Their expressions ranged from blank to terrified to visibly exhausted. Many appeared dazed. A few looked into the camera with a defiance that the surrounding context made heartbreaking. Among the photographs, the youngest detainee was a girl named Rahile Omar, first detained when she was just 14 years old. A child, held in an internment camp not for any crime she had committed, but because her father had been detained in an earlier crackdown. Her photograph, taken when she was nearly 15, showed a young girl with a slightly uncertain look, caught in a moment of bureaucratic processing that no child should ever experience. In Zenz's own words, upon seeing it, "It's striking to see pictures of 14 to 15-year-old girls who are going to be sent to re-education camps." The IEIE oldest detainee in the photographs was 73-year-old Anihan Hamid, an elderly woman whose presence in a camp surrounded by armed guards and surveillance cameras defied every official narrative about the voluntary and rehabilitative nature of the facilities. Alongside the photographs were images of uniformed police conducting what the documents described as anti-escape drills, practice exercises for suppressing prisoner breakout attempts. The officers wore full tactical gear. The facility backgrounds showed watchtowers, perimeter fencing, and the unmistakable architecture of incarceration. Most chilling of all were the classified speeches contained in the files. A speech delivered in 2017 by Chen Guangguo, by then the most powerful man in Xinjiang, contained an order that demolished any remaining pretense about the benevolent nature of the system. Chen ordered that guards at the facility should shoot to kill any detainee attempting to escape. He called on officials to exercise firm control over religious believers. Another document, a speech by Public Security Minister Zhao Keji, delivered in 2018, revealed that the order to expand the camp's capacity had come directly from the top, from President Xi Jinping himself. The camps were not the rogue initiative of local officials, they were a central government program, authorized and directed by China's supreme leader. The Xinjiang police files also contained something that no previous evidence had provided: a direct window into the operational logic of the system at the level of individual detainees. Spreadsheets listed the names and detention records of more than 20,000 Uyghurs in just 2 counties. Operational manuals instructed guards on the procedures for blindfolding and shackling detainees during any transfer between facilities, including transfers to hospitals. Every aspect of the detainee's existence was controlled, documented, and systematized. Chapter 10. The world's response and China's fury. The release of the Xinjiang police files on May 24, 2022 was precisely timed, though not intentionally according to Zenz, to coincide with the first visit to China by a UN Human Rights Commissioner in 17 years. Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner, had arranged a controversial trip to Xinjiang, and the publication of the files cast a long shadow over her visit. Human rights groups were furious at the restrictions placed on Bachelet's access. She was confined to government-organized visits and unable to conduct independent investigations. Her final report, while critical, used language careful enough to avoid directly calling China's actions genocide, and it drew accusations from rights organizations that she had been manipulated by Beijing. But the international response to the files themselves was unambiguous. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated on May 29, 2022, that genocide and crimes against humanity are ongoing in Xinjiang. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, expressed horror at the Xinjiang police files, calling attention to China's mass incarceration of Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minorities. Germany's Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, called for a transparent investigation after shocking reports and new evidence of very serious human rights violations in Xinjiang. Germany's Economy Minister Robert Habeck called the latest leak particularly shocking. The 14 media organizations that had spent months authenticating the files had done their work meticulously. The BBC verified the spreadsheets containing photographs and ID numbers by dialing the phone numbers listed for more than 150 police officers and government officials, several of whom picked up and confirmed their names, roles, and offices. USA Today found that geolocation data embedded in some photographs placed them near the detention facilities Zenz had identified. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published analysis describing the documents as the most comprehensive publicly available evidence of China's mass detention program. Beijing's reaction was predictable in form, but extraordinary in its vehemence. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin called the Xinjiang police files the latest example of anti-China forces trying to smear China, describing the revelations as a repetition of their old tricks. The Chinese embassy in Washington issued statements claiming that Xinjiang residents lived a safe, happy, and fulfilling life. The Chinese government levied sanctions against Adrian Zenz personally, one of only a handful of researchers ever to be individually sanctioned by Beijing, accusing him of severely harming China's sovereignty and interests and maliciously spreading lies and disinformation. Zenz was not surprised. "I think it's understandable China is attacking me," he told journalists. "They're actively trying to cover their tracks in Xinjiang." He continued his work. Chapter 11. The Search for the Missing. Beyond the geopolitical earthquake that the Xinjiang police files triggered, there was another dimension to the release that was deeply personal and human. For years, Uyghurs living in diaspora communities around the world, in Australia, Turkey, Germany, the United States, Canada, and elsewhere, had been unable to find out what had happened to their family members who had disappeared into the detention system. The collective punishment mechanisms of China's surveillance state threatened those in Xinjiang with detention if their overseas relatives even attempted to make contact. An entire generation of Uyghur families had been severed from each other, left in a silence that was as cruel in its way as anything that had happened inside the camps. Following the publication of the Xinjiang police files, Zenz and his team at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation spent months developing something extraordinary, a searchable online database using the leaked files, which, in their full extent, covered approximately 830,000 individuals across more than 11,000 documents. They created a tool that allowed Uyghurs anywhere in the world to search for their relatives by name or Chinese ID number. The results, when they came, were both a gift and a wound. CNN tracked down records for 22 individuals using the tool, reaching Uyghur diaspora members across 3 continents. For the first time in years, exiled Uyghurs were able to see official Chinese documents about the fate of their relatives, including, in some cases, why they had been detained, and in other cases, how they had died. A 73-year-old woman found her son in the records. A man in Europe found that the cousin he had lost contact with years earlier had been detained for the crime of making an overseas phone call. A mother in Australia learned the official reason her daughter had been taken, having too many children. Tens of thousands of people were listed as detained in the documents, Zenz reported. The youngest was 15 years old. This is an inside scoop on the workings of a paranoid police state, Zenz said, and that's absolutely frightening. The nature of this atrocity is becoming more and more clear. Chapter 12. The Scale of the System. The full picture that had emerged by 2022, through the combined work of Zenz, investigative journalists, satellite analysts, and human rights researchers, was almost incomprehensible in its scale. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which had launched its Xinjiang Data Project in September 2020, had identified at least 380 detention camps and detention centers across the region. Zenz's own estimates placed the number of facilities at over 1,000, at minimum 1 camp per administrative unit between the township and prefecture levels. The number of people detained was staggering. By 2018, according to estimates by United Nations and United States officials, as many as 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities were being held simultaneously in the camps. Zenz's own research, based on the progression of the evidence, had by 2020 led him to estimate that a total of 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities had been extrajudicially detained, what he described as the largest incarceration of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. An estimated 500,000 were believed to still be held in some form of detention or incarceration as of the time of the most recent analyses. Beyond the camps themselves, the system had evolved. By 2021, the Chinese government claimed that many of the vocational training centers had been closed, and satellite analysis corroborated that some facilities had indeed been repurposed. But what had replaced them was not freedom. Many former camp detainees had been transferred into the formal criminal justice system, sentenced to prison terms of 10, 15, or even 25 years on charges of terrorism or extremism. Others had been funneled into a forced labor system of extraordinary scope, assigned to factories across China to produce goods for export, including textiles, electronics, and solar panels, goods that flowed into global supply chains touching consumers in every wealthy country in the world. The forced labor dimension of the system led directly to one of the most significant international economic responses: following Zenz's research on Uyghur forced labor in cotton picking, showing that Xinjiang was responsible for approximately 20% of the world's cotton supply harvested under conditions of state-imposed coercion. The US government imposed a ban on all imports of cotton from Xinjiang in January 2021. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, signed into law in June 2022, created a legal presumption that any goods from Xinjiang were made with forced labor and therefore banned from import into the United States unless companies could prove otherwise. The birth rates in Xinjiang told another part of the story. Zenz's research on publicly available Chinese government demographic data had revealed that between 2015 and 2018, population growth rates in the two largest Uyghur prefectures, Kashgar and Hotan, had fallen by 84%. In 2019, birth rates in Xinjiang fell by 24% year over year, a dramatically larger decline than the 4.2% drop experienced across China as a whole. Government documents showed that birth control violations by Uyghur women were punishable by extrajudicial detention. An Associated Press investigation corroborated Zenz's findings with additional evidence of forced sterilizations and forced abortions. The UK's Independent Tribunal on Uyghurs determined that China's population policies in Xinjiang constituted genocide. Chapter 13. The Man. Beijing could not silence the Chinese government's campaign against Adrian Zenz has been as relentless as it has been ultimately unsuccessful. Sanctioned by Beijing, denounced in official state media as a fake expert, the target of a sophisticated disinformation campaign, which the US-based cybersecurity firm Mandiant documented in detail. Finding that fabricated letters attributing false statements to Zenz had been spread through fake news sites created by pro-Beijing actors, Zenz has nonetheless continued his work without interruption. The Global Times, one of China's main state-controlled English-language newspapers, published lengthy attacks on Zenz's credibility, describing him as a far-right Christian with anti-China motivations. Chinese official media tried to weaponize the fact that Zenz is a devout, born-again Christian who is described feeling led by God to pursue his research, as if the sincerity of religious belief somehow undermined the documentary evidence of government procurement orders and official speeches that formed the bedrock of his findings. They accused him of fabricating his estimates. They disputed his methodology. They repeated the word lies so many times that in certain international circles it began to have a hypnotic effect. But the evidence had a life of its own, independent of any single researcher. The Xinjiang Papers, the Caracas List, the China Cables, the Xinjiang police files. Each successive leak was independently authenticated by multiple organizations. The BBC called detainees relatives who confirmed recognizing faces in the photographs. American satellite analysts matched construction documents to visible facilities. The UN Human Rights Office, in a report released on August 31, 2022, the final act of Michelle Bachelet's tenure as High Commissioner, concluded that the extent of arbitrary and discriminatory detention of members of Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim groups may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. Two-thirds of the former detainees interviewed by UN investigators reported having been subjected to treatment amounting to torture or other forms of ill treatment. The report stopped short of the word genocide, a distinction that outraged Uyghur advocacy groups and satisfied nobody entirely. But it represented something that had seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. An official United Nations acknowledgement that China had likely committed crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, against the Chinese Communist Party, the most powerful authoritarian government in the world, found credibly suspected of crimes against humanity by the organization it had once hoped would validate its narrative. And a significant part of the foundation for that conclusion had been laid by a man who, as recently as 2017, had been a relatively obscure academic in Germany, working a second job as a software programmer to fund his research, reading government documents on the internet. Chapter 14. The Sea. Lessons of an Extraordinary Exposure. What does the story of Adrian Zenz and the exposure of China's detention camps in Xinjiang tell us? It tells us many things. About the fragility of authoritarian systems in the digital age, about the power of methodical documentary research, about the unexpected ways in which history can be shaped by individuals who are neither powerful nor famous. It tells us that governments, even governments as powerful and as secretive as the Chinese Communist Party, make a fundamental error when they assume that secrecy can be maintained through the sheer volume of information they suppress. In the age of the internet, information escapes in unexpected ways. Budget documents get uploaded to provincial government websites. Job postings are publicly available. Satellite imagery is accessible to researchers around the world. And sometimes, a person with the right skills and the determination to look carefully enough can find a pattern in the noise that the generators of that noise never intended to be visible. It tells us about the courage of anonymous sources. The Chinese government official who, at enormous personal risk, handed the Xinjiang papers to the New York Times because they could not bear to remain silent. The anonymous hacker who penetrated the police computer networks of Xinjiang's security apparatus and handed the result to a researcher they had never met, trusting that the truth would find its way to the world. These unnamed individuals, operating in the shadow of consequences that could include imprisonment or death, made choices that changed the history of this story. It tells us about the durability of facts. China tried everything to destroy Zenz's credibility. It levied sanctions. It published denunciations. It deployed disinformation campaigns. It used diplomatic pressure on international institutions to soften their conclusions. None of it erased the procurement documents, the budget reports, the satellite images, the classified speeches, the 5,000 photographs, the 20,000 case files. Facts, once released into the world, proved extraordinarily difficult to suppress. And it tells us something about the nature of the crime itself. The detention of over 1 million people, on the basis of their ethnicity and religion. The systematic dismantling of a culture's identity through mass incarceration, forced labor, compulsory indoctrination, population control, family separation, and the destruction of religious sites and practices is not a policy that a government announces. It is a policy that it hides, denies, minimizes, and euphemizes. The hiding is part of the crime, and the exposure of what is hidden, the insistence that the world see what is being done, that the faces behind the statistics become visible, that the names be recorded, that the reasons be documented, is an act of profound moral importance. Zenz himself, in reflecting on the Xinjiang police files, described seeing the photographs of detainees as deeply difficult. "I have dealt with devastating, very, very grievous material before," he told CBC Radio. But seeing images of people, looking in their eyes, seeing their facial expression, seeing some of their dejection, or maybe a faint glimmer of hope amidst hopelessness, it was just very hard to describe, really. This is not the language of a propagandist or a political operative. It is the language of a human being confronting the reality of mass suffering and choosing, despite that difficulty, to keep looking. Chapter 15. What remains? As of the time of this script's writing, the situation in Xinjiang continues to evolve, and not toward resolution. The Chinese government maintains that the vocational training centers have been closed and that the region is stable and prosperous. Independent verification remains extremely difficult as Beijing continues to restrict access for journalists, human rights investigators, and foreign diplomats. What satellite analysis, continued document leaks, and testimony from recently released detainees and their relatives indicates is more complex. While some of the largest camp facilities appear to have been repurposed, the infrastructure of control remains in place. The iJop surveillance app still operates, the armed checkpoints still stand, The mosques remain stripped of their minarets. The Uyghur language schools that once transmitted culture across generations have been transformed into Mandarin medium institutions. Children whose parents were detained have been placed in state-run boarding schools, described by some researchers as a system of de facto orphanages designed to cut the transmission of Uyghur identity between generations. The forced labor system, which Zenz characterized as in some ways even more expansive than the camp system at its peak, continues. State work. Plans from 2024 mandate continued labor transfer quotas targeting ethnic minority populations in Xinjiang. International companies continue to grapple with the question of whether their supply chains, which often stretch through layers of subcontractors and sub-suppliers, are free from goods produced with Uyghur forced labor. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States has given legal teeth to this concern, but enforcement remains a work in progress. The Xinjiang Person Search Tool, an online database developed by Zenz and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation using the leaked police files, remains operational, allowing Uyghurs in diaspora communities to search for information about relatives who disappeared into the detention system. For some, it has provided answers, however painful. For others, it has confirmed fears. For many, the search continues. And in the international legal and political arena, the question of accountability remains open. The United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and several other Western governments have declared China's actions in Xinjiang to constitute genocide, a legal and moral designation of the gravest kind. The UN Human Rights Office has found credible evidence of crimes against humanity. But the mechanisms of international justice move slowly, and China's status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, with veto power over any Security Council action, means that formal accountability through the most powerful international institutions may remain elusive for years or decades. The World Uyghur Congress, the Munich-based umbrella organization for Uyghur advocacy groups, continues to push for concrete international action, welcoming the UN's findings while calling for stronger international leadership. The families of the detained and the disappeared continue to wait. Epilogue. The impossible made visible history is full of moments when the truth about atrocity was known, suspected, documented, reported, and the world nevertheless looked away. The Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Gulag, the Rwandan genocide. Each of these events had witnesses, had documentation, had people who knew and said what they knew. And in each case, the combination of political convenience, economic interest, institutional inertia, and sheer human capacity for denial allowed the machinery of destruction to operate longer than it should have. We do not know yet how the history of Xinjiang will ultimately be written. We do not know whether the Uyghur people will one day see justice for what has been done to them, whether those responsible will be held to account, whether the cultural and human damage of these years can ever be repaired. These questions remain open. What we do know is that the truth was found, that the camps were exposed, that the faces of the prisoners were given to the world, that the speeches of the officials who ordered their detention were recorded and published, that the names of the children who were taken from their parents were documented, that the reasons, the absurd, monstrous, bureaucratic reasons for which people were imprisoned were laid bare for anyone willing to read them. And we know that a significant part of the reason the truth was found is because a man who worked as a programmer for a streaming startup in his spare time, who had never been to Xinjiang except once as a tourist in 2007, who was not a government agent or a spy or a traditional journalist, sat down at his computer and read Chinese government documents more carefully than the people who wrote them ever expected. He compared a procurement order to a budget report to a job posting. He identified a pattern. He published his findings. He kept going when Beijing denied it. He kept going when Beijing changed its story. He kept going when Beijing sanctioned him personally and launched a disinformation campaign to destroy his reputation. He kept going. That is not nothing. In a world where the machinery of an authoritarian superpower is designed specifically to make the truth impossible to find and impossible to prove, one person's methodical determination to look carefully and report honestly can change what the world knows. It does not by itself change what the world does. That requires political will, institutional courage, and collective action. That is far beyond any individual. But it changes what is knowable. And what is knowable can, in time, become what is undeniable. The detention camps in Xinjiang are not, in the end, China's hidden secret anymore. They are part of the documented record of our time. The photographs exist. The documents exist. The names exist. The faces exist. Whatever happens next, they cannot be unhidden. One man started the work of making them visible. An ordinary man, in an ordinary office, reading documents that no one else had thought to read, and refusing to look away from what he found.